you so much for being here today. Happy Hispanic Heritage Month. We are kicking off our second webinar of our series throughout the Hispanic Heritage Month. So thank you so much for joining us. It's going to be a very exciting session. We have with you presenting us, and we are very, very lucky and fortunate to have her with us today, Cynthia Manuel. She is the founder of Authentica Consulting. Cynthia is an equity, diversity, and inclusion and leadership development consultant, facilitator, strategist, coach, and TED Talk speaker. So if you have not checked that out, make sure you check that out as well. She's also a mentor for women of color. She's a first generation Latina. She has over 19 years of experience working with racially diverse communities and organizations throughout the United States. We are going to be sharing with you her topic, which is, are you Latinx? So she will take us through an amazing informational journey about what does it mean, and just, several explanations on the term. This is going to be very informational. We're very lucky to have her. So I am just going to let Cynthia take over.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Perla, and thank you for all of you to join. I'm really excited to be in this space with all of you. And yes, I also agree the background is amazing. So thank you, Sochi. So let me present now. So that was, I'm excited. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself in a second, but yeah, I'm excited to share with you a little bit of the history about what the terminology, or I guess the complexity, starts to come when it comes to Latino, Latinas, Hispanics, Latine, Latinx, all these different terms that we kind of use to identify ourselves. So before I get going, I am fighting a little bit of a cold, so I might get a little stuffy here and there, but I got my tea, so we're good. So I, typically when I start my presentations, I like to say a little bit about myself, just because I feel like sometimes you come into the space and you're like, who is this person that is talking to me? Like, do I connect with them? And sometimes it just helps build that relationship. And we literally have like 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes to get acclimated with each other. So I was born and raised in Mexico City. That's me, little me right here. I was in Mexico City until I was 14 years old. So I have a lovely family, my parents and my sister, who they're my world. And they've been my rock and been there to support me along the way. And I put my quinceañera picture here because that's literally, I had my quinceañera in the United States, and it was a little bit different because I left 90% of my family in Mexico, right? So being in a new space, in a new country, but also finding the love of community. And and then I have this other picture here. So I was a recipient for the Gates Millennium Scholarship. So if you're familiar with this, a really nice scholarship that basically gave us a blank check to go to college. So I will say that is one of the things that I'm really, I'm very proud of, because of my parents' sacrifice, I was able to go to college and be here today, have all those opportunities to be here with all of you, and start my business. So I started my business 4 years ago. I actually come from corporate. I went through tech, through healthcare, nonprofit, and 4 years ago I took that leap, that journey, and so I started my company called Authentica. And Authentica is really all based on the community. Actually, the name came from a community gathering that I had. And so it really represents my love for the community to give back in any way. So that's me. And okay, so in the chat, let's start with this topic. So in the chat, I would love if you can just type, how do you racially, ethnically, or culturally do you identify? So again, so it's not a quiz. I just want to see, what's it called? I just want to see, again, what's coming up in this space, right? As we're talking about this topic today. So I see Latina, Hispanic, Latino, Mexicana from Austin, Texas, Latina. All right. Mexicana, Hispanic, Latino, Irish, German, Polish, great, Venezuelan, yes. Okay, perfect. Keep them coming. Hispanic, Latino, Cuban, yes, yes, yes. Okay, so as we can start seeing, right, and this is not surprising for many of us, we definitely we're going between terms, right, when we're trying to identify ourselves. And I think a lot of the times, depending on the space.
Yeah.
Oh, Thomas, I think, okay, there you go. And I think depending on the space that you're in, right, you might be switching how you identify, or maybe not, right? So this is something that we're going to explore a little bit today. And thank you so much for everybody who put in stuff in here. I do want to ask you to take a quick look at everybody, so I guess you can see who is in the room. All right. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of the history behind the term, Hispanic, Chicano, Chicana, Latinx, Latin, Latino, Latino, Latine, Latine, Afro Latino. And there's a lot in this slide even, and I'm missing a lot more. Okay, so it's not everything, but I just wanted to kind of give you some information, some background on some of the key terms that you maybe might be hearing most about. All right. So when we see some of these terms, sometimes, especially terms that we're not used to seeing or we're not used to hearing about, we might come up with questions like, what is that? Which one is correct? I feel erased if you're using this term versus this other term. Why does this term exist? I can't even pronounce the term, or it's overwhelming to have so many terms. Again, what I show you is not all the terms that are used. And also, which term is used where, right? Or who gets to use what term in some ways. So there's a lot of questions. I don't know that I'm going to answer all those questions. Again, I'm giving you information so that you can make your own judgment. You can, kind of unpack your own journey. I'm not here to tell you this is what you should call yourself or how you should identify. I'm just going to provide you some of the history so you can understand where that comes from. All right. So I would love to ask for a volunteer to read this slide. I promise you, I won't quiz you. I just want to get my voice out of the space for a little bit. So just a volunteer, and you can just raise your hand or your digital hand, and I can call on you. I promise it's not scary. Anybody?
If no one wants to volunteer, I can do it, Cynthia.
Okay, well, let's do it, Sachit. Oh, there you go, Caroline. and did I enunciate your name correctly?
It's Carolyn, but it happens a lot. So thank you.
Well, no, I mean, you want to make sure I get it right. Thank you.
Well,
okay, please.
Okay, so 1800s, 1846 to 1848. The U.S. invades Mexico for its land and resources. The Mexican-American War. The war ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. Transferring over 55% of Mexican land to the U.S., present-day Arizona, California, New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Colorado, Nevada, and Utah. The treaty promises to protect the lands, language, and culture of the Mexicans living in the ceded territory. Those who decided to remain were promised citizenship and the right to their property, language, and culture. The treaty also gave the right to Mexicans to stay in the U.S. or move to Mexico. Residents could choose to keep their Mexican citizenship or become U.S. citizens. If they decided to become a U.S. citizen, they will be considered white.
All right, thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. So as you can see here, this is where we kind of start some of the history of the terminology, right? So some individuals that decided to become U.S. citizens were kind of automatically granted, or should have automatically been granted, the identity of white, right? And then there were some individuals that were like, well, we can't go anywhere, right? Because we're in this land, the border kind of cross us, but we're still gonna be identified as Mexicans. So you were already kind of starting to see some different, some terminology kind of floating. But even then, right, like we're not, again, I'm not gonna go through this whole history, but I really encourage you to take a look at this, a specific one, so you can start understanding, because later on, we then learned, right, that even the treaty was not actually, what is the word that I'm looking for? It was not respected. So even though some individuals legally should have been considered white, they were not. Some individuals were, some individuals were not. So again, there was a little bit of confusion as to, again, who gets to claim that and who, and why did they choose to do that, right? As well as those who decided to stay Mexican and be, again, in some of the legal documentation, be considered white as well, even if they didn't want to. So in the 1800s, around 1850s in San Francisco, terminology started to kind of emerge. And the term Hispano-Americanos started appearing in ads in this newspaper. How the Hispano-Americanos came about, I'm not sure. But again, this is terminology that is emerging in the 1800s. Now, closer to the 1900s, now the term Latino-Americano started to come up in California. So now we're starting seeing parts of the country where some of the terminology is being, some terminology is being used, some other terminology is being used. Again, I'm not sure where this came from, but that's a term that started emerging in the early 1900s. Now we continue, and then the term, in Latin America, the term Latino started to emerge, right? And that was because of the conversation that I started to have, because people were like, so if we were from Latin America, should we be identified differently? Again, I'm not going through the whole history, but this is one of the first times that you see the term Latino kind of start popping up. Just not Latino-Americano, just Latino. Now, then, going back to the early 1800s, between like, well, I'm considered Mexican. Should I be called Americano? Should I be called Mexican? What should I be starting to use? And so a lot of individuals that had Mexican heritage started to using the term Mexican or Mexican American, right? To like kind of start differentiating a little bit. And so again, you start seeing a little bit of that separation from just one being clumped in one group. Then in the 1930s, so right in the 1920s, we saw a lot of immigration coming to the U.S., and that was because the U.S. was needing to staff areas to build railroads. So they started bringing a lot of people, especially from Mexico, to work on the railroads and to help build the railroad system. Well, now in the 1930s, the U.S. Started deporting those families that they brought, those workers that they brought. And for the first time, there was a conversation because they were saying, well, now we have, quote unquote, too many people from Mexico in the United States. So, but we need to start counting how many people we have, right? Because there wasn't a right way to count. There was, and there were, people that will come through different programs and whatnot. So then the census started having this conversation of, why don't we put on the census a bubble to identify Mexicans, right? Because that's really what they kind of were focusing on, where they saw the most people coming through. And they wanted to put Mexican as a race in the census. But because of all these deportations that were happening, LULAC came in and said, hold on, U.S. Census, we're actually not going to allow you to do that, because that is discrimination. Because what guarantees us that you're not going to utilize that information to deport more families or to deport more people? So we're not going to accept, and we're going to fight you so that you don't put Mexican as a race, because what they were saying is, we are white race, we are Americans, right? So again, I just want you to pause for a little second to start again thinking about this battle between identities, right? So you have this really strong organization in the United States saying, no, we're white. We're nothing else but white. So accept us as white, accept us as Americans. So again, some people were like, well, but I'm Mexican, so should I be white now? Right? And some people that were part of the treaty, or their families that were part of the treaty, they're saying, well, hold on. I was granted being white when, the treaty happened. So I'm white. So why are we questioning me being white? So, okay, I would love another volunteer. You see, it wasn't hard. I didn't quiz anybody. I would love another volunteer to read this one slide, please. And you can raise your digital hand. Anybody? Okay, Deborah. I saw your hand. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, it said I was muted for some reason. Latino students were expected to attend separate Mexican schools throughout the Southwest, bringing in the 1970s. At the beginning, the schools were set up to serve the children of Spanish-speaking laborers at rural ranches. Soon, they spread into cities too. By the 1940s, as many as 80% of Latinos children in the place, like Orange County, California, attend separate schools. Among them was Sylvia Mendez, a young girl who was turned away from an all-white school in the county. Instead of going to the pristine, well-appointed 70th Street Elementary, she was told to attend Hoover Elementary, a dilapidated two-room shack. The bare-bones facilities offered to students like Mendez lacked basic supplies and sufficient teachers. Many only provided vocational classes or did not offer a full 12 years of instruction. Children were arbitrarily forced to attend based on factors like their complexions and last name.
Perfect. Thank you so much for reading that. So as you can start seeing here, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Sylvia Mendez, but definitely if you're not, go look her up. So her family was one of the key families in California to end segregations in school. But when Sylvia again wanted to go to school, right? Her parents are like, well, she should be able to go to the school that is closest to home, right? That makes sense. But again, because of the segregation at that time, she wasn't allowed to. However, Sylvia had cousins, and two of her cousins, and they were a little lighter skinned than she was. So when they went to the school, because they went all at the same time, the school actually told her cousins, okay, I think you might be able to come here to the nice school because you're lighter skinned. But Sylvia, you're darker skinned, so you cannot come to the school. So yes. Thank you so much, Carol. That's true. Mendez is definitely the case for Brown and the Board of Education. So definitely, again, this is a big thing, So again, when a school when separated, again, just because of your last name or the way that you looked. So again, even if you were identify as white or as Latino or anything else, it didn't matter because they were looking literally at your last name and your skin color. Side note, Sylvia Mendez got the Medal of Freedom from President Obama. So yay! Again, for all the work that her family did. And this definitely should be another presentation. But in the 1930s, so like now we're gonna move a little bit. 1930s, 1979, the term land started to be used in Chicago, but not in LA. Again, we're starting to see terminology starting to emerge. Then Latin American, descendants started saying, well, I don't identify as Latin. I don't identify as a Latino. I don't know if I'm Latino Americano. So I'm just gonna use my nationality. I'm Mexican, I'm Venezuelan, I'm Salvadorian. And then also the term Chicano, Chicana started to emerge. And that was a term that was being used to identify individuals who were natives of Mexico or had Mexican descent. And this is derived from the word Mexica. So now individuals from Latin America in the census, because we still had the battle, right? We're still identified as white at this point. So even though we are, as community, And whatever we were coming from within this community, even though some of us didn't see ourselves as white, some people did, the census legally saw everybody as white because they hadn't figured out a way to separate anybody yet. Then I want to spend just a little bit of time on the Chicana term, because it's not just a term, it's part of a larger movement. And so before it became a Chicano term, that, what it is today, it actually used to be a very negative word used towards Mexicanos or towards the individuals that have Mexican descent. It wasn't a word that you wanted to be called. But it wasn't until the 1965 and 1975 where the movement actually changed. And that word changed its meaning, changed its terminology to be more positive and more, and people were actually proud of the term, versus being used as something negative towards the community. So the Chicano movement, so before it became the term that it is today, Mexican Americans actually attempted to assimilate, right, into being recognized as part of the community, being recognized as white, having the same rights and the same benefits, and being seen as equals. When they start seeing that they were definitely not getting much momentum, they were not, the idea was not changing, they said, hey, oh, thank you for sharing that. So definitely that wasn't changing, right? They said, okay, so what are we gonna do to actually be proud and kind of take control of this term and make it our term? So in the 1960s, that's when all this changed. And then they said, no, we're gonna be proud. If we're gonna be Chicanas, we're gonna be proud, and we're actually gonna do something for our communities, right? So the Chicano movement really focused a lot in bringing bilingual, bicultural programming to the Southwest. They improved conditions for migrant workers. They influenced the hiring of more Chicano teachers in schools. And then they also helped push a lot more Mexican Americans to become officials in their cities. So the movement, again, was really in some ways, gained that space in the United States, that recognition, that support that the community needed so much. So then we moved to the 1970s, and then this is where the term Hispanic started to kind of emerge, right? Now we have all these terms kind of navigating, and then the term Hispanic is introduced in the census form. It's a lot of conversation before that. But now the US is all right, let's think about a term where we can, put everybody in, because it's going to be easier for us because there's so many terms, right? So then they said, we're going to use the term Hispanic. And then in the 1970s, they actually started to use the term Hispanic only in certain forms. So back then, the census wasn't as long as it is today. And only certain families will get the long census form that will go more in depth. If you were one of those families, then you actually will see a bubble that will say Hispanic. And then in the 1980s, finally the census, finally the census said, okay, now that we kind of tested the market, now we're gonna actually make it official and use Hispanic as the term to separate individuals that don't identify as white or that they are not considered white. And then also in the 1980s, the term Latino started getting a little bit more momentum, because then people are well, because the term Hispanic really basically says, if you come from a Spanish-speaking country, then you are considered Hispanic. And we know that Brazil, for example, in Latin America, is not part of the Hispanic term. And then, like I said, in big cities like LA, but not in Texas, people started using the term Latino more. So it became much more popularized. And then again, in Texas, which is really interesting, right? Again, individuals that were born in Texas, especially in the 1800s, and in the early 1900s, their birth certificate will say white, right? So then again, when we start talking about like legally, what should you really consider yourself to be, right? Like there's so much history behind why is that you identify that the way that you do today. Okay, so how, many ask, well, why did the term Hispanic really kind of took off, and why do we use it today? And then in the 1980s, we had we had a few shows that we watched, right, as a community that really we connected with. El show de Cristina with Cristina Saralegui, right? It was she really kind of when you look back at her tapes, like the term Hispanic really emerged in these conversations. And excuse me, and it really kind of resonated a lot with people, because the message that came along with the term Hispanic was, we are community, we are one, right? We can relate in similar struggles. So it really became more community oriented, and it was a way that people started identifying with one another a lot more. It wasn't that she was saying everybody has to be called Hispanic or identify as Hispanic, but the sentiment behind the term started to have a bigger meaning to a lot more individuals. And then in 2000s, the census added, the term Latino as a new category. Sometimes it's mixed. And then they wanted to use this term to identify people that came from Latin America, right? But we know that not everybody who comes from Latin America identifies as Latino. Some do, some don't. And then also in the early 2000s, we had the term Latinx emerge. And, I don't know that there's, I've been looking and discussing this with different individuals too, but it's not clear exactly when the term Latinx really emerged, but many indicate that it was in the early 2000s. And that was because Latino is binary, right? So people went in like, no, we want to make sure that we're including everyone. So a non-binary term that emerged was Latinx, but didn't really have much momentum in the early 2000s. It wasn't until about 2015 that it really started kind of picking up again. And there's a lot of controversy around the term, how it emerged, who created it, why do we have to use that? And it's actually a term that was developed in the United States. So it was emerged in the United States. So there's also some negative emotions towards that. And so that's when the term Latine came about. So, and then emerged again because of all the criticism received by the term Latinx. And so it still is gender neutral. It's more pronounceable, but it's also a term that was created and emerged from Latin America. So if you go outside of the United States and you use the term Latinx, many people might not understand what it means. If you use the term Latine, some people may know it. There's still a little bit of that pushback still, especially in Latin America. But again, it's a term that was emerged in Latin America. Okay, looking at time. We have a little bit more time. All right. So again, there's a lot of terms, right, that are emerging, and it really is based on your experience, on your heritage, how you identify yourself, what it means to you. But like I said, the majority of individuals will identify by the country of origin. And again, it's easier for them because they can say, here is where I am from, right? I can try to find their individual identity, so not to be put together with a bigger group. So people will say, I'm Mexican, soy Mexicano, I am Salvadorian, yo soy Salvadoreño, right? The term Hispanic was created by the US government, and this was to identify individuals from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Central America, South America, and other Spanish-speaking countries, including Spain. And it really focuses more on language than geography. The term Chicano, Chicana is a term to identify individuals from Mexican parents born in the U.S. The words derive from the term Mexico, pronounced Mexicano, and it also recognizes indigenous and African roots. So it's a very prideful term. Now, I have been told, and I have had conversations about even today, the term Chicano is emerging still. So there's some conversations about truly who should be identified as Chicano nowadays. So there's a lot of conversation even within these terms today. So I do invite you to, if you're curious, to dive into that. And if you notice at the very top, I'm putting just how I have seen these terms being spelled out. I'm not saying that one or the other is correct. This is just how I've seen it through in books and content, and also the people write it, or being enunciated in conversations. So again, this is not the right or wrong way to do it. It's just the different options that I have seen. Like, for example, Latino or Latin, right? Or Latino, Latina, or Latina with the at icon, because it's the O and then the A in the middle. So I do that a lot to shorten things. But so Latino, Latina is a person of Latin American origin or descent, a term predominantly used in the US. Again, if I go outside of the United States, and for example, I'm Mexican, like I said, and when I go to Mexico, I don't say I'm Latina in Mexico. People would not be like, what the heck? They see me as Americana, or they see me as Mexicana, right? But they don't see me as Latina. So again, it's a term predominantly used in the United States. And this term excludes individuals from Spain. And it's more based on geography. So Hispanic is based on language. And this one is specifically on geography. Latino, Latina is geographical. So now it does include Brazil, because they're part of Latin America. And then most of the Caribbean. So it's a little bit more broader. Then we have Afro-Latino, which again, Afro-Latino is also another term that doesn't get used a lot. And it should. Afro-Latinos, are the majority in Cuba and the Dominican Republic. Also Brazil, Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and they form a significant minority. When we're looking at the numbers, outside of Africa, I believe Brazil has the largest Afro-descendant population. So again, and it's a little bit more, when I think about Afro-Latinos, right? So I think I saw a survey that about 26% of Afro-Latinos don't identify as Afro-Latinos, because they're like, no, they identify differently, right? So even there's a lot more complexity when it comes to Afro-Latinos than there is even just being Latino or Hispanic, because it is shaped not only by the race, their skin tone, and other factors like the history. So there's some individuals that will never identify as Afro-Latino, and then others that again, they're very proud of that term. Right now, 6 million in the US of adults identify as Afro-Latinos. So that's, and then 1 in 7 Afro-Latinos do not identify as Hispanic. Okay, so again, we're starting to see like the complexity in terminology, right? Who is Hispanic? Who is Latino? Who's Afro-Latino? Like all these different nuances in between this terminology. I just put this graph, I thought it was cool. It says, hi, I'm Latino. The other person says, hola, I'm Latina. And then the person, the drawing behind underneath says, I don't identify with either gender. And the other person says, and I'm gender fluid. So what are we supposed to use, right? And like I said, Latinx is a little bit, or try to be a little bit of that solution for that. And again, Latinx, people use Latinx, and the idea is not just this term. The idea is that you will change every gender word in the Spanish language, in the Spanish-speaking language, instead of any word that is gender, to switch one of the vowels for the either O or the A for the X. I'll give you an example. So right here on the bottom, instead of saying Latinoamericano or Latin American, you're going to say Latinx American and Caribbean descent. Right? So I'll see if I have an example. Yep, I have an example here. So the idea was bienvenidos, which is welcome, is a gender term or gender word, right? Because the O makes it all like if you're speaking to males, even if there's females in the room. And by adding the X, you will substitute the O for the X to make a gender neutral word. But the problem began because a lot of the words with the X, adding the X, are very difficult to enunciate too. So I don't even know how to enunciate this. I will say something maybe like bienvenidos, right? So it doesn't roll easy. It's really hard. And to remember like exactly how to pause or anything like that. I don't know that there's been that education as to this is how we switch the words if we want to make it gender neutral. Because it's not just saying the term itself. It's like you got to make sure that you are creating a gender neutral environment. So the Latinx, Mexico here says Latinx, and then Argentina's like, ¿qué? Like, what? Colombia's like, no entiendo. I don't understand. Right? Because they're like, how do you write this? And so that's, again, when the Latine or Latine with an accent term emerge. It's still a gender neutral term in Spanish. And this actually, like I said, individuals in Latin America utilize this term much more instead of Latinx. And it's a term that it comes from resistance and it's easier to pronunciate. It also was created by the LGBTQA+A, gender non-binary and feminist communities in Spanish-speaking countries. So again, it has a stronger meaning, is, and it's easier to enunciate, but it comes from like the community built it, right? Versus the conversation about Latinx, where part of the conversation is it was not community. It didn't come from the community. It came from individuals in the US. Some people say that it came from a white professor. Some people say that it came from academia. So again, it's a lot of controversy around Latinx. So let's do the same example with the Latine, or make it gender neutral. So bienvenidos, right? Same example. We're going to change the O to the E. So bienvenides. It's a lot easier, flows better. And if you start seeing, and just if you listen to Spanish television, some people, some shows or some individuals, when they're doing interviews, you will hear them using this enunciation a lot more than the X on Latinx. Yeah, absolutely. Like language is a big part of it, right? We're gonna make sure that. Okay, we're gonna skip the question preguntas slide because I wanted to show you something really quick. So this is my family, right? And so we're getting to the part of like, so how do we identify ourselves, right? My sister, so she for a little while worked for schools. So she's a social worker and she was kind of like the mental health wellness advisor. And she identifies as Mexicana, but when she was in school, she will sometimes say, oh, I'm Latina, right? Because we're so used to the Latina term. I mean, we came here in the early 1990s. So definitely like our brain has been much more exposed to the term Latino, Latina. But whenever she will use the term Latina to describe herself amongst her students will be like, no, these are high schoolers. They're like, no, you are Latinx. And so she started using the term Latinx, again, by peer pressure in some ways, right? And so she'd be like, I don't identify with Latinx because it doesn't have a meaning for me, but I'll say it because otherwise, she's like, I totally understand why we have to be gender neutral. She's like, I just don't feel right using Latinx, right? And this is before Latinx even emerged into the conversation. My parents are, because also my dad was here, it was like 1980. So the only term he recognizes is Hispanic, or that he identifies with. He's older, and so my mom, when we came to the United States, I remember we were very fortunate and privileged that we actually flew in and came in. And so when we were filling our immigration forms, the only box available for us to fill was Hispanic. So my mom was like, oh, I guess we're Hispanic now, right? And so both of them really identify a lot with Hispanic. Like they will say, if they're saying something about themselves, they'll be like, oh, we're Hispanic. But if somebody calls them Latinos or Latina or Latino, they'll be like, oh yeah, they connect with that. But that's not the first choice. Does it make sense? And then, because again, my sister and I grew up more here with the term Latina, that's the term that I default most often to. But at the end of the day, we always claim being Mexican. Now more than ever, everywhere we go, we're like, we're Mexicanas y Mexicanos, you know. I hardly use Mexican American in my vocabulary. But again, even though I didn't use it before I became a citizen. And even now that I'm a citizen, it still is very difficult for me to do that. And it's not because I have nothing against the term. It's just, if I feel closer to Latina than Mexican American, but my first choice will always be Mexicana. Again, the complexities, right? And so I just wanted to show you really quick as we're closing with this presentation. So people are like, all right, Cynthia, cool. So you told me about these terms. Again, these are not all the terms. So who's using what terms out there, right? Because I mean, who am I to say this is the term that you should use? So the term Hispanic is used 61% in the survey that I got the numbers from the Pew Research Center. 61% of individuals identify as Hispanic. 29% identify with Latino, or Latina. 3% identify with Latinx. Again, that number, this was back in 2020, so it's been 3 years. This number probably looks a lot different now. But again, it still pretty consistent, even in the conversations. Latinx, 3%. Chicano, Chicana is also about 3%. And Afro-Latino, so I just put in here because they didn't have information on Afro-Latinos, but I did find out the survey said 25%, again, of individuals with Afro-Latino descent do use the term Afro-Latino. And then there was no data with Latine, because again, that term, even back in 2020, it was still pretty new. But when you look at the numbers, right, people are like, oh yeah, that makes sense, Hispanic, right? It's been here the longest, people identify more. But then one of the things that I bring up is also in so many of the legal documents and government documents, like the term Hispanic, like the choice Hispanic. So even if we don't identify with a term, when it comes to legal documentation, that is a term that we're basically asking people to fall into or to be part of that bucket, right? And so again, even though when we're looking at these numbers, there's so much more, because one of the things that I wanted to show you is on the census. We have the census it's not our best friend, but they're trying to make something work in 2030, I heard. But right now, even part of the census, right, many people will say, oh, I'm gonna scratch this out. I don't fall into any of these buckets, so no bucket for me. And I'm actually, census gonna tell you, here is how I identify. So in the last census, 47.4 million people chose the other race box. They did not care that the census had created boxes for them, because they're like, nope, I'm actually gonna tell you how I identify. I'm gonna be the one claiming that instead of you doing that for me, because it has much more meaning. So out of the 47.4 million people, 44.3% wrote their nationality. 22.7% wrote, oh, I'm Hispanic or Hispana or Hispano. And 10% wrote Latin American, Latino, or Latin. And so again, right, individuals are trying to are wanting to be seen by how they identify themselves. And there's a little bit of that resistance of like, we don't want to be put in a bucket. And we're going to create our own bucket, or even if you have a bucket for us, I'm going to go outside the bucket and still write down what I want to be identified as. So there's a lot of complexity when it comes to identity. And it really is, at the end of the day, it comes down to, how do you identify yourself? What is important to you? And nobody should be telling you, this is how you should identify yourself, right? And the other thing is, like, you can go between terms as much as you want. Like, I go between terms all the time, based on who I'm talking to, based on how comfortable I am in the space, or if I want to be seen or no seen as well. But one of the things that I was going to say is, even though I became a US citizen, but that didn't say, oh, Cynthia, you're white. You're going to check the white box, right? So even then, it's still a lot of complexity with that, because I'm a US citizen. However, I'm not white. And so what are the other quote unquote boxes that I feel I connect with, or that quote unquote I feel I'm allowed to check as well? So it's a lot of conversation. And when we think about all of this, is, oppression basically showing up, because we can't just be who we are. We still even have to have these conversations about how do we supposed to identify ourselves amongst or group. How do we identify in the US? How do we identify in our countries of origin? If we are born outside of the United States, who gets to claim what? And how much their skin tone or last name or accents play a part of this identity that we're part of, or identities that we want to be part of. So with that said, I am really hoping that you were able to just gather some information, see how complex this is. And just one thing before I forget, when I talk about identity, one of the big pieces that I remind myself is the amount of privilege that I also have to be in spaces where I can have this conversation. The fact that I'm able to peel the onion in the way that I can, because of the resources, the access, the information, the groups that I can go into to have these conversations. That also defines to who gets to identify with what term as well. Because I think of my parents again, and they don't get to be in a lot of the spaces that I get to be in, right? So they're only gonna know what they know through their experience and through what I share with them. And I have other opportunities where I can then probably maybe have a bigger voice, or be able to have more time to process this information and to go through my own unpacking of who is Cynthia, or who I want to be, or how do I want to be seen in the spaces that I walk in. So again, just wanted to point that out there, because oftentimes we don't think about that. All right. Well, I'm going to end it so then we can have some time to chat. And I see the chat going here. Sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye here and there, but yeah, so I don't know if we have any questions in the chat.
Yes.
But yeah, any questions, comments?
I have a
Yes.
question.
Okay. Yes.
So you had, first of all, a very great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And it kind of gave me an insight on how things are used. So like now, even me being Latino Hispanic, like now I better understand the terminology. But you had a slide on Latino, Latina, and it said something about North American, and I was assuming that it was all Latin American countries, including South America. Was it more like a historical thing? Like it started off as, Northern or North American residents calling themselves Latina, or does it include South America as well?
Yeah, so let me see it really quick. Is that the one? Is this slide?
No, it was just the Latina slide.
Sorry, everybody, giving you a headache. This one?
Right there. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so actually the term Latino, Latina, it started in, was a term created in the United States. It is not necessarily meaning that, oh, sorry. No, I'm wrong. So the term Latino, Latina was a conversation that was had with Latin America to say, okay, people don't want to be called Hispanic or identify as Hispanic if they're coming from Latin America. And also the other thing too was that people wanted to disassociate themselves from Spain because of the whole conversation of the colonization with the term Hispanic. As the term Hispanic is only saying, oh, if you speak Spanish, you're in, right? If you don't speak Spanish, then you're not Hispanic. And Latin America was like, no, let's look at the geography. If you're from Latin America and Brazil is part of Latin America, they should be included, and as well as the Caribbean should be included in the term. So it was more of an alternative, right, for individuals that say, hey, I'm coming from South America or Central America. Am I considered Hispanic, right? And so they're like, no, we're going to make it our own. We're going to separate from Spain and Latin America. So like you said, Mexico, Central America, and South America, quote unquote, are allowed in some ways, or can use, not allowed, can use the term Latino, Latina.
Cool. Thank you.
Does that help? Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I wanted
Anybody
to add
else?
something. I
Yeah.
wanted to add something as well. I encourage you guys to join our Cafecito con Cultura book club. We are actually reading a book called Finding Latinx by Paola Ramos. She is Jorge Ramos' daughter. If you know who Jorge Ramos is, he was a big Mexican news television anchor. And then in the book, just to give you a little bit of like sense, the term Hispanic was adapted during it's been reported, right, that the term Hispanic was adapted during the Richard Nixon administration to kind of whitewash Latinos, because you could more closely associate the term Hispanic with our European roots, our white European roots, rather than the indigenous roots. So it was adapted during the Richard Nixon administration, just to more closely associate us to Europeans rather than Latin America. So it's just, this book is full of insights, and looks so many other things regarding this topic that is so complex but so fascinating at the same time. So I highly encourage you to do that. I just wanted to add that now that we were like on that Hispanic.
No, thank you, Perla. And that's what, when we think about like colonization, right? Like people are like,
Yes.
we don't want to be part of the quote unquote European,
Yes.
like anything European, we don't, right? Because it's like we're
Yes.
separating ourselves and not regaining who we are. And I think that that's when you think about the terminology, that's what it's trying to do a lot of the times, is disassociate ourselves with a specific group, or
Correct.
really highlight or roots, especially or indigenous roots in some ways. And so, but now there's so many, and these are not all the terms. Also, there are a lot more terms that are being used, and they mean something to those individuals that are using it, even though we may or may not agree. It's not for us to decide. It's for each person to say, here's how I want to identify myself because of my beliefs, my experiences, what I want, right? How I want to experience this world. So that's the one thing I say is really just be respectful. And sometimes when the big question I get is, well, which term do we use then? And I was like, well, the one that I recommend is using the term that mainly your community uses. However, always leaving space to say, this is just what we're doing, because we have to use a term to address the larger crowd. However, we want to make sure that we respect how you identified. So finding ways to always make sure that those other identities also get highlighted. Yes, absolutely. Like, we're not a monolith group at all, right? And these terms is what it's trying to, for a lot of us, trying to do is put us in one bucket. But like I said, it's very complex. No, we don't belong in buckets. Awesome. I think we're at time, but I want to thank, the Thing LCUP team for the invitation, for the space, because it's just really great being in community, especially to talk about these topics.
Awesome. Thank you, Cynthia.